Hi everybody, it's Miss P. I am going to do a quick review of some of the compromises that the Founding Fathers had to make when writing the Constitution. I apologize if my voice sounds a little worse than usual. I am fighting off a cold, so bear with me. We're going to be looking at two of the big compromises that the Founding Fathers made when they wrote the Constitution, and those would be the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. Before we do that, we're going to do a quick review both of the word compromise and then a few things you'll need to remember for all of this to make any sense at all. Let's jump in. What exactly is a compromise? Let's say that I want a sausage and pepperoni pizza for dinner and I cannot stand vegetables on pizza. But then you want a veggie pizza because you're a vegetarian and you don't eat meat. We could compromise and order a plain cheese pizza, which would mean that neither of us would be miserable, even if we're not getting exactly what we want. That would be a compromise, which is defined by Merriam-Webster's Learner's Dictionary as a way of reaching agreement in which each person or group gives up something that was wanted in order to end an argument or a dispute. So in our case, I really wanted meat. And you really wanted veggies. But, we weren't going to agree on this, so then we just went with cheese. So that is a very simple example of a compromise. Obviously, the compromises that the Founding Fathers made when they wrote the Constitution were a lot bigger and more important than this, but a compromise is a compromise. Nobody comes away with exactly what they want, but hopefully everyone walks away with something that is at least kind of okay. In case anyone just wandered in off the street, here's where we're at in history. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. And that's when basically the colonies just said, nope, we want to be our own nation. And Great Britain, who, owned the colonies, didn't take too kindly to that. And so they went to war, and that was the Revolutionary War. As we know, because we're not still a part of Great Britain, the colonies won their independence and became a new nation. And then they had to figure out what kind of government they wanted. And so they decided on the Articles of Confederation. It was like their first try at government. And it didn't actually work very well. The government, the central federal government or national government just wasn't strong enough. It couldn't do things like make people pay taxes. So a whole bunch of the big wigs in society and government then called what's called a constitutional convention. And originally they got together and they're like, oh, we're going to try to fix this. We're going to make the Articles of Confederation work. But they quickly realized that they weren't going to be able to fix it. So that's when they decided they were going to write a whole new constitution. So that's where we're at. We're at this big meeting, this big constitutional convention. And a whole bunch of guys, they're all white guys, are trying to figure out exactly what kind of government they're going to have. The problem is there was a whole lot that these states didn't agree on. And so to form a new government, they had to do a whole bunch of compromising. We're going to take a look now at the two big compromises that you're out. The Great Compromise was the idea of a man named Roger Sherman. And to sort of back up a little, the whole problem was how many representatives should states get. So I've come up with two completely fake, random, non-existent, hopefully obviously non-existent states. We've got Ovalia, which has a population of 30,000. And we've got Rectangle Land. Ovalia is 300,000. We've got Rectangle Land, which is 3 million. Okay, these are both states, but obviously they're very different. If you were to form a government, how many representatives would you say that each of these states get? They each get to send a person or some people to the capital to help make laws. How many should Ovalia have? How many should Rectangle Land have? There are lots of ways to answer this, and I can't say that one answer is better than another, but that's the question that the Founding Fathers had to sit down and try to figure out. Two plans came to the surface. A guy named Edmund Randolph introduced the Virginia Plan. And basically this plan called for a really strong central government. And, you know, the part we're really looking at here is that the higher the state's population, the more representatives it gets. So big states like Rectangle Land would have really, really liked the Virginia Plan. Obviously, the smaller states weren't happy with this. They didn't really think that was super fair. They could see that their states wouldn't have very much power. So a guy named William Patterson, and it's Patterson with one T, drafted this plan and called it the New Jersey Plan. He was from New Jersey. Basically, he wanted a weaker central government. And he wanted every state to get the same number of representatives. The number he wanted was 1. So let's take a second. 2 fake states. We've got Rectangle Land and Ovalia. Which state do you think would have gone for which plan? I don't know for sure because this is totally and completely fake, but I'm guessing that Rectangle Land probably would have wanted to go for the Virginia Plan, and that Ovalia would have been a fan of the New Jersey Plan. No proof because they don't really exist. So they had to compromise. And the compromise that they came up with was written by a guy named Roger Sherman. And basically he came up with this idea of a bicameral, bi meaning 2 and cameral meaning basically house, legislature. And he said that basically he would take these 2 ideas and we're going to do one of each. The House of Representatives is based on population. Which would have made big states like Rectangle Land fairly happy. And then the Senate, you get 2 senators no matter what. Teeny tiny states get 2 senators. Huge states with enormous populations get 2 senators. Everyone gets 2. So this would have made Ovalia fairly satisfied. The second compromise we're going to look at is just based on one big question. And that is, do slaves count as people? This seems a little silly, but it's kind of a valid question that they had to answer because they had. If you had to guess, we've got some states where slavery is legal, and we've got some where they're called free states where it's not legal. If you were to guess, who do you think would want to count a slave as a human being? Now I want you to think about that a little differently. Based on what you know about population, who do you think would want to count slaves as part of their population? Slave states, even though they didn't really think of slaves as, human beings on the same level of themselves, slave states wanted to count slaves in their population. Free states, or states where slavery was illegal, didn't want those states counting their slaves in their population because that would have given those slave states more power. So free states wanted to not count slaves. The compromise they came to is really, really creatively, okay, not creatively, called the 3/5 compromise. Basically, what they said is that when figuring out a state's population, a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, I know this is just, it's really bizarre to think about right now, like that is not a full person. But it kind of makes, it was the closest they could come to, given that they did in fact own slaves. So it would work like this. If a state has a slave population of 20,000, so a whole bunch of free people plus 20,000 slaves, they would only count 3/5 of that. So we're going to find 3/5 of 20,000, which is multiplying by 3/5. That's a 5, ladies and gentlemen, which equals 60,000 over 5, which equals 12,000. So they have a slave population of 12,000. So they would take their total population of non-slaves, let's say they've got 800,000. I'm just making these numbers up. They would add the 12,000 and get 812,000. That would be their total population. This didn't make either side completely happy, but this is another example of a compromise that they had to come to just in order to be able to, create a functional government. The U.S. Constitution is a document of compromises. Benjamin Franklin once said that I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better. He, basically he knew this wasn't perfect. He knew it wasn't exactly what he wanted, but he also knew he wasn't going to get anything better. So we've talked about these two compromises, the Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise. And those are the two big ones that everybody needs to know about. But there were so many just little compromises they had to make. A couple other fairly major ones had to do with slave trade. Again, the free states and the slave states had to come to an agreement about what are we going to do about this issue of slavery. And they didn't write it into the Constitution that slavery would be illegal or that people couldn't buy or sell slaves. That decision ultimately wouldn't be made for many more years, but they did say that the legislature could make laws about slavery. There's also this issue of the Bill of Rights. There were some rights that certain delegates wanted included in the Constitution, and others didn't. So what they ultimately compromised and decided to do was to write out this Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments or additions to the Constitution. And that was just a way of making sure that they were a part of the law, but not in the original Constitution. We'll go to in much more detail about the Bill of Rights in the future, so kind of keep that in the back of your brain. Thanks for listening, and I hope that this helped clear things up a little bit.